Braiding Sweetgrass is a book that covers two very different views of the world, the European way and the Indigenous way. Robin Wall Kimmerer applies her scientific understanding of the world with the Indigenous teachings to bring them both together in a very interesting way in this book. Stay tuned to this episode where I'll cover some of the things that I have learned from this. Hi, my name is Scott Gillespie of Plants Dig Soil, the name of the podcast and the consulting company. We're an independent agronomy company. We do not sell products, we provide advice only. We focus on realistic regen ag, which has to be proven and profitable. We work in person or remote or a combination of the two. Our pricing is set to be affordable to anyone from a Q&A package to full farm planning. There's no long-term commitments. You can retain our services, do it yourself, or hire others. Of course, we always love to work with people over the long term. So let's start out at the beginning of this. First of all, this is a very large book. It covers many stories, many themes, many ideas. It's almost 400 pages, and I found it to go a little bit long, so I'm not even going to try to cover most of the themes in here. And the other important thing is that I'm looking at this from the perspective of the colonial side. I'm a white person, a white man. I have many generations of European heritage behind me, so I can see it just from my lens. But it's a fascinating book because Robin has the scientific training and also covers her issues with getting into scientific training and trying to reconcile the two sides of seeing the world. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the interesting things that I see. But just like normal in any of the other book reviews I've done, I'm not following a particular format or trying to be thorough on it. I'm just telling you some of the interesting things that I learned, and I hope that you will pick it up sometime or get the audiobook version of it and listen to it. It is a great one to just put on and listen to a chapter a day or just occasionally, because each of them have some very interesting stories, very interesting things to think about. Now, every culture has its creation stories, and any indigenous cultures, especially across North America, will all have different versions or different parts of a story. In this particular case, she's talking as a person from around the Great Lakes area of North America, and the story here is mostly about a person who is known as Sky Woman, who comes from the sky and is taking care of the creatures that are already on the earth, and they help her to get established, and then she brings forward the generation of humans that inhabit the earth. Now, the common theme that I've seen of similar creation stories in where I live right now, in the prairies of North America, is the idea that the humans were considered to be the newest people around, and kind of the little brothers, or the ones that needed a lot more help than everyone else. And so when you see things from this perspective, you're always looking at the nature around you to be teaching you. In fact, that's kind of its job, is to be teaching you, and your job is to be learning from it. And she contrasts this with the European, which is basically the Christian view of things, where we have a very adversarial view of creation. For anything, or from the original story, for touching the apple tree, the humans were banished, and they were forced into subduing nature and always being fighting against it in their battle for survival. And so it may not seem like a big thing, but when you start thinking about it and thinking about how much the two worldviews oppose each other, and how much in subconscious thinking and how you approach things, it's a very different way of seeing things. And with me looking at regenerative agriculture and what it can do, I think this is where some of the conflict is because regenerative is looking at, okay, what can we learn from what's going on and how can we apply it, whereas more traditional agriculture or conventional agriculture is about controlling the environment. And I like how Robin does point out that there isn't a way to go back to the way it was here in North America. She's not suggesting that that's how it has to be. It's just a way of changing your perspective on things and looking at what can be done differently, or how can we look at things in a different perspective. So the other part of the book that really directly applies to agriculture or regenerative agriculture, and a lot of what I talk about on this podcast, is the three sisters. So if you're not familiar, a very common indigenous practice across all of the Americas was a corn, bean, and squash intercrop. And so at its most basic, the corn comes up first, or grows first and builds this nice strong stalk. The beans come next, and they have a stalk to climb up and trellis on. They also are making their own nitrogen, and though some people believe that it gives its nitrogen to the others, I'm not so convinced on that, but that's a lot of the story behind it. But however, it does add more nitrogen, and I guess if you think about it, more protein into the diet because of its presence. And then the squash is there, and that, once the main weeds are controlled, when it takes over, it's the much later one, it shades the ground, and of course it just covers everything as it just vines all over the place. And so these are three plants growing together, and when you put them all together, or when you have a diet with these three in, you actually are covered fairly well. Now, people wouldn't live entirely off of this because there was always buffalo around, or other sources of meat or protein, and of course there's always other plants around, but these were the staples. So she does cover these in one chapter in the book. Now, one point that she comes up with that I have never covered in this podcast before, at least I don't think I have, is the idea of reciprocity, where instead of us just trying to grow things or trying to maximize the amount that we can possibly get out of it, we look at the plants or the animals that we're raising to as in a relationship with us. Now, what is an interesting thing, and I have seen this before in other in scientific journals, or even in some articles, is that something we have to think about when we're looking at growing our own crops is that they are domesticated. So when people look at the natural world and just say, well, why can't we just live with the natural world and live within it? the natural world works a lot differently, because a plant growing in a natural system only needs to do enough to um, make its own progeny pass on to the next generation. It doesn't need to grow as much as possible. And so when we have these crops, we are, we probably get upset at how much we have to do to prepare the soil or add fertilizer, either synthetic or manure or other forms of fertilizer, or having to weed them. But the reason we have to do this is that they're depending on us to take care of that. They are competitive, but they aren't. They are adapted or growing in a system that has somebody else taking care of that other stuff. And you might think that that's only a modern thing, but if you think about centuries or millennia, which is actually, agriculture has been developing for its estimated 10,000 years. If over generations you pick the plants that grow the best under the way that you care for them, or if you're passed on seeds of something or genetics of something that are adapted to that but give a little bit more calories or a little bit better yield or can grow in a little bit better conditions, you're growing something that is dependent on you doing that for it. So how do we apply this to our farming systems or our gardening systems going forward? Well, we don't have to go back and try to replicate the system. This is a system that was created because it worked, and because there were vast trade networks that could help spread knowledge and even genetics throughout. I remember reading in the book Buffalo Birdwoman's Garden, she would actually get new varieties of corn that came long distances through trade networks, and she would try them out. And if they fit into her system better, or if she liked them better, she would start growing them and saving that seed and building up different, what we would call varieties for her garden. So we shouldn't try to just replicate the system. We should apply it to what we're doing. Another thing that can get lost, especially if you're reading this with a non-agricultural background or even non-gardening, actually probably more non-agricultural, because in a gardening system you could replicate this or do something similar in a backyard garden, because you can walk in and you can do all the hand applications, the hand you can do everything without mechanization. A system like this would almost never work in a mechanized system, because there's different planting dates, there's weeding, and then there's vastly different harvest dates. Things could be, the corn might be ready early, or maybe even the beans are ready early, especially if you eat them a little immature, and then the squash is something that's going to be way later in the fall to mature. So we can't just say that we need to go back to this, but we can look at our intercropping systems or our intercropping cover crop systems, which I have talked about in a couple previous episodes. We can apply this knowledge into them rather than just trying to say we should be intercropping. We can look at what the problem is that it might solve. So as you can tell, I've only covered what I learned from a couple chapters in this book, and there are 32 chapters in the book. Personally, I think it could have been 2 books. It could have either been 2 books expanded out, or pared down maybe to a little shorter 1-volume book. But regardless, to me, I think it's a great book if you want to expand your horizons and perhaps just make it a goal of reading or listening to a chapter once a week, and absorbing the information and the different perspectives in it. So thank you for listening to this episode, and I will talk to you again next time.